"Show us what you've got," he sneered, tossing her the violin. A wealthy man wanted to humiliate a black waitress for his amusement, but when she started playing, the tables turned in a way no one saw coming. The restaurant shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers, the air thick with the scent of aged wine and extravagance. Conversations dripped with arrogance, laughter punctuated by the clinking of gold-rimmed glasses. Tonight, the elite had gathered. Business moguls, socialites, and men who measured their worth by the weight of their wallets. Among them moved Aisha, a waitress who had learned to blend into the background, her presence acknowledged only when a glass needed refilling or a plate needed clearing. Dressed in the restaurant's crisp black and white uniform, she moved with quiet efficiency, her expression unreadable. But behind those calm eyes was a story no one in this room cared to know. Once, before life had twisted her path, she had been a prodigy, a violinist whose fingers could weave magic from strings, a girl who had stood on grand stages with the world at her feet. But fate had been cruel. A tragic accident had taken everything: her family, her future, her music. The violin had gone silent, and she had been forced to rebuild her life from the ground up. Now, she served the kind of people who would have once paid thousands to hear her play, and they never saw her. Not really. Across the room, Richard Sterling, a man who thrived on power and humiliation, leaned back in his chair, watching Aisha with a smirk. A self-made millionaire with a taste for control, he enjoyed reminding those beneath him of their place. To him, the world was divided into two types of people: those who commanded and those who obeyed. And Aisha, in his eyes, was nothing more than an invisible servant. Then, it happened. Aisha reached across the table to clear a half-empty glass, but before she could steady it, Richard moved deliberately, knocking the glass over. The deep red wine spilled across the pristine tablecloth, a crimson stain spreading like a wound. The conversation at the table halted. Eyes turned. The smirk on Richard's face widened. "You should be more careful," he drawled, his voice laced with amusement. But then again, what else can you expect from a waitress? The sting of embarrassment crept up Aisha's spine, but she bit her tongue, her fingers tightening around the empty plate in her hand. Then Richard's gaze flicked across the room, to a violin resting in its open case near the grand piano. He chuckled, turning back to Aisha. "You know what? Why don't you entertain us?" He gestured lazily to the instrument. "Play something." A hush fell over the table. A few of his companions exchanged smirks, already anticipating a moment of second-hand embarrassment. Aisha, the quiet little waitress, fumbling through an instrument far beyond her reach. Aisha's heart pounded. Her fingers ached at the thought of touching the strings again. It had been so long, too long. She could refuse. She could walk away, endure the whispers, the laughter. But as her eyes met Richard's, she saw it. The expectation of failure, the certainty that she was nothing. And that was when something inside her shifted. Slowly, she set down the plate, wiped her hands on her apron, and turned toward the violin. The room held its breath as Aisha stepped toward the violin case. The air was thick with anticipation, but not the kind that welcomed talent. This was the anticipation of a spectacle, of humiliation served on a silver platter. A few guests exchanged knowing glances, smirks tugging at their lips, already predicting the awkward screeching notes that would fill the space in the next few moments. Richard leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass of whiskey with lazy amusement. "Go on," he urged, voice smooth, but laced with mockery. "Let's see if you have any real skills outside of serving drinks." Aisha reached for the violin, her fingers trembling, not with fear, but with something deeper, something raw. The weight of the instrument in her hands sent a jolt through her body, awakening a part of her she had buried long ago. She brushed her fingertips along the polished wood, feeling the ghosts of past performances pressing against her skin. She could hear the whispers now. She's actually going to do it? This is going to be painful to watch. What a waste of time. Aisha inhaled sharply, steadying herself. She lifted the violin to her shoulder, fingers resting against the fingerboard like they had never forgotten. Her left hand curled instinctively, muscle memory guiding her, while the bow in her right hand hovered just above the strings. Richard chuckled under his breath, lifting his glass to his lips. "Any time now," he teased. Aisha's eyes met his for the briefest second, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Then, she played. The first note cut through the room like a blade, pure, haunting, commanding. It was not the hesitant, out-of-tune scratch they had expected. It was something else entirely. The laughter died in an instant. Glasses froze mid-air. Every whisper, every smirk, every dismissive glance vanished, replaced by stunned silence. Richard's smirk faltered. Aisha didn't stop. She let the music pour out of her, each note a testament to the years she had spent in the shadows, the pain she had carried, the dreams she had been forced to abandon. The violin sang for her, filling the room with a melody so rich, so aching, that it demanded to be heard. The waitstaff peered from behind the bar, their mouths slightly open. The guests, who just moments ago had been eager to see her fail, were now caught in the spell of her music. Even the pianist, a seasoned musician who had performed for the wealthiest patrons, sat motionless, his fingers resting lightly on the keys, unwilling to interrupt whatever magic was unfolding before him. Richard's fingers tightened around his glass. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to be this. Aisha closed her eyes, letting the music flow through her veins. She wasn't playing for them anymore. She wasn't playing to prove a point. She was playing because she had found herself again. The melody surged through the room, weaving through the air like a force of nature. It was no longer just music. It was a reckoning. Each note struck with the weight of something unspoken, something raw and undeniable. The elegance of her technique, the fluidity of her bow, the intensity of her expression, everything about Aisha in that moment defied expectation. A hush had fallen over the restaurant, an unnatural silence that carried more weight than words. The diners, once so eager to witness her stumble, were now spellbound. Some sat frozen, wine glasses untouched, breaths held as if exhaling might shatter the fragile moment. Others leaned forward unconsciously, drawn in, their expressions shifting from amusement to awe. Richard Sterling, the man who had orchestrated her humiliation, found himself at the center of the storm he had created. His smirk had disappeared entirely. His fingers, still gripping his glass, remained still. The room had turned against him, not in open defiance, but in something far worse: indifference. They had forgotten him. The power had shifted, and he could feel it slipping through his fingers. Aisha continued, her eyes closed, lost in the music. The violin was no longer just an instrument. It was her voice, speaking the truths she had swallowed for so long. Every struggle, every dismissal, every moment she had been made to feel small, it all poured into her performance, turning pain into something transcendent. Richard cleared his throat, a subtle attempt to break the spell, but no one reacted. The attention that had once orbited around him was now drawn, unshakably, to the woman he had tried to belittle. And then, As the final note rang out, a soft, lingering whisper that melted into the silence, Aisha lowered her bow. For a moment, no one moved. Then, a single sound shattered the stillness. A slow, deliberate clap. It came from the back of the room, where a distinguished-looking man, in a tailored suit, sat with his hands pressed together, nodding in approval. He wasn't just any guest. He was Gregory Langley, a world-renowned music producer, a man who had shaped the careers of some of the most celebrated musicians of the decade. Another clap followed, then another. The sound built, spreading through the room like a wave, until the entire restaurant erupted into applause. Aisha opened her eyes, her chest rising and falling with the force of her performance. For the first time in a long time, she saw something different in the faces around her. Not pity, not condescension, but recognition. And then, there was Richard. He sat motionless, his jaw clenched, his face pale, with something dangerously close to humiliation. He had lost control of the moment, of the narrative. The joke had turned on him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Gregory Langley stood, his voice cutting through the applause. "Miss," he said, his gaze fixed on Aisha, "where have you been hiding?" The question hung in the air, filled with possibilities. And for the first time in years, Aisha felt the answer stir inside her. Aisha barely had time to process the question before Gregory Langley stepped forward, his sharp, discerning eyes studying her as if she were a mystery he had just uncovered. The restaurant, once a stage for her humiliation, had become a concert hall where she held every soul captive. The applause hadn't died down yet, but the weight of Gregory's words had already shifted the air in the room. Richard, still gripping his glass, scoffed, forcing a smirk onto his lips. "Well," he drawled, "seems our little waitress has a hidden talent. Who would have thought?" His voice was casual, but there was an edge to it, an unease he couldn't mask. Gregory ignored him entirely. His attention remained on Aisha. "I've been in this industry for over 30 years, he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "I know brilliance when I hear it. And that," he gestured toward the violin in her hands, "was something extraordinary." Aisha's fingers tightened around the neck of the violin. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from something deeper, something dangerous. Hope. Richard leaned back, letting out a short laugh. "Come on, Greg. She's a waitress who happens to know a few notes. Let's not get carried away." His tone was forced, almost desperate. Gregory's expression didn't change. "You're wrong." He turned back to Aisha, his voice firm. "You don't just happen to play like that. That kind of talent, it's rare. It's cultivated. It's lived." The room hung on his words. Some of the guests shifted in their seats, suddenly aware that they had been part of something more than just a casual dinner spectacle. They had witnessed the kind of raw, undeniable brilliance that couldn't be ignored. Richard felt the shift, too. He could sense the power slipping from his grasp, the control he had wielded so effortlessly, just moments ago, unraveling before him. His fingers drummed against the table, his jaw tightening. "I used to play." Aisha finally spoke, her voice steady but tinged with something unspoken, "before life got in the way." Gregory's eyes darkened with understanding. "And now?" he asked. Aisha exhaled slowly, looking down at the violin in her hands. For so long she had let it remain silent, convinced that the world no longer had a place for her music. But now, here, in this room filled with people who had once looked right through her, she realized something. She wasn't invisible anymore. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's been a long time." Gregory's lips quirked into a knowing smile. Talent like that doesn't just disappear. And if you're willing to find your way back, I'd like to help." A ripple of surprise ran through the crowd. Aisha's breath hitched. Help. An opportunity. A door that had once been slammed shut, now cracked open just enough for her to see the possibilities beyond it. Richard clenched his jaw, his irritation barely veiled. "Greg, you can't be serious." Gregory turned, leveling him with a stare. "I'm very serious." His tone was final, dismissing Richard as effortlessly as one might swat away an annoying insect. Then, with a nod, he extended a hand to Aisha. The choice lay before her. She could walk away, return to the quiet life she had carved out for herself, pretend that this moment had never happened. Or she could step forward. Aisha looked at Richard one last time, the man who had tried to break her, who had underestimated her, who now sat powerless in the presence of something greater than him. Then, with steady hands and a heart pounding with new purpose, she reached out and shook Gregory Langley's hand. The moment Aisha's hand clasped Gregory Langley's, a new energy filled the room. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the air, a slight widening of eyes, a murmur rippling through the crowd. But beneath it all, something fundamental had changed. Richard Sterling felt it immediately. For the first time in years, he wasn't the most important person in the room. The weight of his wealth, his name, his influence, it had always been enough to command attention. But now, it felt like nothing. Because in this moment, no one was looking at him. They were looking at her. Aisha, the waitress he had mocked, had just been offered something he could never buy: recognition. He forced a chuckle, trying to reclaim the moment. "All right," he said, lifting his glass as if to brush everything off. "That was a nice little performance, but let's not get carried away. This is just a dinner party, not a concert hall." His words landed flat. No one was laughing with him. No one was even paying attention. The tension in his jaw tightened as he watched Gregory Langley turn fully toward Aisha, completely ignoring him. "If you're serious about stepping back into music," Gregory said, his voice filled with conviction, "I want you in my studio. I've worked with some of the greatest musicians of our time, and what I heard tonight, you belong among them." Aisha's heart pounded in her chest. This couldn't be real. Could it? She felt the weight of every struggle, every moment of invisibility, pressing against her like a tide threatening to pull her under. And yet, here she was, standing on the edge of something new, something terrifying, something that felt right. Richard wasn't done. His pride wouldn't let him be humiliated so easily. He leaned back, arms crossed, his smirk returning, forced, but still there. "Come on, Aisha," he sneered, using her name for the first time all night. "Do you really think this is how the world works? One song and suddenly you're a star?" Aisha turned to face him. For the first time, she looked at him not with caution, not with deference, but with something Richard had never expected: power. "No," she said simply. "I think this is how my world changes." The room fell silent again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of anticipation or surprise. It was the silence of realization. Aisha wasn't just proving a point. She wasn't just a waitress who had surprised them with a hidden talent. She was someone they had underestimated, and now they had to sit with that. Gregory gave a small, approving nod. "You have my card," he said, pressing it gently into her hand. "Call me." Aisha's fingers curled around the card as she nodded. Richard clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around his glass, but there was nothing left for him to say. The game was over, and he had lost. As Aisha stepped away from the table, violin still in hand, She felt something she hadn't in a long time. She felt seen. Aisha stepped away from the table, the weight of the violin in her hands no longer a burden, but a reminder of who she truly was. The restaurant around her, once suffocating with judgment and condescension, now felt different, lighter, quieter, almost reverent. She had entered this room as a waitress, invisible to the very people she served. She was leaving as something else entirely. As she made her way toward the staff exit, she caught the eye of a fellow waiter, Daniel, who had watched the entire thing unfold from the sidelines. He gave her a slow, knowing nod. That, he whispered as she passed, was legendary. Aisha smiled, not because she had humiliated Richard Sterling, not because she had silenced an entire room of people who had looked down on her, but because, for the first time in years, she had played for herself. And that was enough. Outside, the night air was crisp against her skin, carrying the distant hum of city life. She pulled out the business card Gregory Langley had given her, running her thumb over the embossed letters. A chance, a beginning, a choice. She had spent so long believing that her talent no longer mattered, that the world had moved on without her. But tonight had proven otherwise. The question wasn't whether she was good enough. It was whether she was ready. She took a deep breath, staring up at the night sky. Then, slowly, purposefully, she slipped the card into her pocket. Tomorrow, she would make the call. Sometimes, the world underestimates you. Sometimes, people like Richard Sterling will try to define your worth based on what they see, not who you are. But at the end of the day, your talent, your passion, and your voice belong to you. And when the moment comes to prove yourself, take it. Have you ever felt underestimated? Have you ever had a moment where you turned the tables on someone who doubted you? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Because sometimes, all it takes is one moment to change everything.